In this movie, we're going to create the clouds and the birds out here in the background. And we're going to do so very simply by once again clicking with the blob brush and the eraser tool. But this time, we're going to adjust the roundness of the brush. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my document in progress, which as you can see, is a little different than the one I created in advance. And now I'll switch to the blob brush, which I can now get by pressing the B key. And I'm going to increase the size of my brush by pressing and holding the right bracket key. But I also want to create something of a flatter brush, something that's not exactly this round. And so I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac. And notice these options down here below the size value. We've got angle and roundness. Well, angle's not going to make any difference until you adjust the roundness. And you can do that by either reducing the roundness value, so anything less than 100% is an oval, as you can see right here. Or you can drag these little handles that are located on either side of the ellipse. Then you can modify the angle if you're so inclined. And in addition to adjusting the angle value down here, you can drag this little arrowhead on the right-hand side of the oval. In my case, I'm going to leave the angle value set to 0 degrees, and I'm going to change the roundness value to 75%, and then I'll click OK to accept that change, and you can now see that I have a flatter brush. At which point, I'm going to scroll over a little bit like so. And of course, I want the clouds to be white, and so I can either change the fill to white, or I can specify a white stroke, like so. And then I'll press the Escape key to hide that panel, and I'll go ahead and click right about here to create my first oval. Then I'll reduce the size of my brush, and I'll click there, and I'll reduce it even farther and click right about there, above the guy's ear. And I might want to put another oval right about there, and possibly a larger one here, and perhaps a smaller one right there. And then I'll just paint the rest of the cloud in order to finish off that effect. And now I'm going to go ahead and create another one over here on the right-hand side. And you may have noticed that I kind of missed joining these guys together. And that's because I was clicking in different locations. And because of that setting, that checkbox up here, merge only with selection, I have to have the cloud selected in order to merge them, which means that I could press the Control and Shift keys, that's Command and Shift on the Mac, and then click on this cloud to select it. And then if I just drag like so, I'm going to merge all those clouds together. All right, now I might press Shift right arrow just to nudge those guys to the right a little bit. And now I'm going to zoom in even more, and I'm going to press Control Shift A or Command Shift A on the Mac to deselect the clouds. And I'm going to change the fill color up here, either fill or stroke actually, to this light shade of gray where all the RGB values are 204. And then I'll press the Escape key to hide that panel. And I'll go ahead and increase the size of my brush a little bit more, and I'll click there. And then I'll reduce the size of my brush, click right about here, and I'll increase the size again and click there. All right, now what we need to do is erase away some of these ellipses so that just the bottom edges of the clouds are gray. And so I'll do that by first switching to the eraser tool, which I can now get by pressing the E key, and then I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to bring up the eraser tool options, and I'll change its roundness value to 75% as well, and press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to apply that change. And now I'm going to make my brush just slightly smaller than this right-hand ellipse, and I'm going to click right about there, and now I'll make the brush smaller still, and click here, and then I'll make the brush bigger, and the eraser tool seems to react much more quickly than the blob brush to you pressing the bracket keys, so just bear that in mind. And then click a third time in order to create this effect, and now I'll press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac to deselect those paths. All right, now let's go back to the very first cloud and select the blob brush once again. And it looks like my cursor is big enough to click right there in the center of things. And now I'll reduce the size of my brush, and I'll click here and here, and then finally I'll reduce the brush size even further, but not too far because I want to be able to click on that selection right at this location here. All right, now I'll return to the eraser tool. Again, you can get that by pressing the E key. And I'll click here with a slightly smaller brush, I think, and right about there with a pretty large brush. A still bigger brush is needed at this location, and then a smaller brush again right there. All right, now I'm going to switch back to the blob brush, and I'll go ahead and zoom out by pressing Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac. And I'm going to zoom in on the right-hand side once again to create those birds. And I'm going to make that happen by pressing the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to once again bring up this dialog box. And this time I'm going to take the roundness value down to 50%, and I'll click OK in order to accept that change. And I'm going to change the fill color to black this time. And I'll just go ahead and click right about there and just to the right to add another ellipse to that shape. All right, now I want to erase into those shapes slightly. So we'll switch back to the eraser tool, and I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to bring up the dialog box. I'll change the roundness value to once again to 50%, and then I'll press the left bracket key a couple of times in order to reduce the size of my brush, maybe to about there, let's say. So my ellipse brush is a little bigger than the one that I used with the blob brush tool, and now I'll click right about there. All right, now I'm going to press the V key to switch back to the black arrow tool. I think my bird is a little too big at this point, so I'll click on the word Transform up here in the control panel, and you want to make sure that the chain icon is turned on, at which point I'll go ahead and click on the W to select the width value, and I'll change it to 50 points, and that'll reduce the size of the bird quite a bit. And now I'll go ahead and move this guy over to right here, let's say, and then I'll create a copy at this location by pressing and holding the Alt key at the end of the drag, and then I'll create a third bird over at this location right there. And then I'll go ahead and press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac to zoom out. I think these guys should be on the background layer, so I'm going to go ahead and marquee these shapes over here on the right-hand side, and then I'll shift marquee the ones over here on the left-hand side. I messed up that shape right there. I went and colored it black. But in any event, I'm going to unlock my background layer by clicking on its lock icon. Then I'll drag that purple square down so that all the shapes are now on the background layer. I'll click off the shapes to deselect them. I'll select this guy again, and I'll click on its fill icon and change it back to that light shade of gray. And then I'll click off the shapes to deselect them. Unfortunately, that went and selected the sky. And so to deselect it, I'll just go ahead and lock down that layer by once again clicking in that second column. And now I'll zoom in slightly so that we can take in the final effect. And that's how you create a couple of cartoon clouds and some distant birds by once again simply clicking with the blob brush and the eraser tool set to reduced roundness values.